92 ancient skeletons, 92 people who lived and died across the Americas over an 8,000-year span, buried long before Columbus ever set sail. Scientists sequenced their DNA expecting to trace a direct, unbroken line down to the indigenous peoples living in those same regions today. Instead, they found almost none of them had any descendants left at all. Not a shrinking trace, not a diluted remnant. In the vast majority of cases, an entire genetic lineage that had persisted for thousands of years simply stopped. And it stopped at almost exactly the same moment history says European ships started arriving. That is not a footnote buried in an academic paper. That is ancient DNA directly measuring the scale of a catastrophe historians have argued about for 500 years, and the number it produced is worse than most people, including many of the researchers involved, expected to find. This isn't a single isolated finding either. It's the endpoint of a much longer, stranger genetic story, one that starts tens of thousands of years earlier on a strip of frozen land that no longer even exists. This is the story of what genetics has actually revealed about the first Americans, from the frozen, thousand-generation isolation that created them in the first place, to a genetic ghost population still unexplained deep in the Amazon, to the moment their bloodlines were nearly erased on a scale we are only now able to measure directly in bone and tooth, rather than only in the written record left behind by the people responsible. Before we go further, if you want history measured in hard biological evidence instead of estimated from old records alone, go ahead and like this video right now, because this is exactly the kind of story that deserves to be told carefully with real sources, rather than sensationalized for a headline. To understand why the ending of this story is so disturbing, you first have to understand just how fragile and improbable the beginning of it was. Somewhere between roughly 25,000 and 15,000 years ago, small groups of people living in northeastern Asia began moving across Beringia, a vast stretch of land now submerged beneath the Bering Strait, that once connected Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. This wasn't a quick crossing. Genetic evidence strongly supports what researchers call the Beringian standstill model, the idea that these migrating populations became stranded, isolated on this land bridge for a period stretching anywhere from roughly 2,400 to as much as several thousand years, cut off from their Asian relatives by advancing ice sheets, slowly accumulating genetic differences simply by being trapped in one place for that long. Every single Native American population alive today, from the Arctic to the southern tip of Patagonia, traces back to this single, narrow, geographically stranded founding event. And when geneticists actually calculated how many people were involved in that founding population, the number is almost uncomfortably small. All Native American mitochondrial DNA lineages alive today descend from just 5 founding maternal lines, each tracing back to a common ancestor roughly 18,000 to 15,000 years ago. Genome scale studies since have confirmed and further sharpened this finding. The entire genetic diversity of 2 continents, tens of millions of people across thousands of distinct nations, languages, and cultures, traces back through an almost impossibly narrow founding bottleneck. A group of people small enough that a bad winter or a disease outbreak at the wrong moment could plausibly have ended the entire story before it began. In January of 2018, this story got a genuinely unexpected twist, discovered not in some remote excavation everyone had been anticipating, but in the remains of 2 infant girls. At the Upward Sun River site in central Alaska's Tanana River Valley, archaeologist Ben Potter uncovered the burial of 2 infants dated to roughly 11,500 years ago, laid to rest together with red ochre and finely made hunting tools. When researchers, including evolutionary geneticist Eska Willerslev, sequenced the genome of one of the infants, they found something nobody had anticipated. She did not belong to the ancestral population of any living Native American group. Her lineage had split off from the ancestors of all other Native Americans, roughly 20,000 years ago, apparently remaining behind in Beringia, while another branch of the same founding population continued south into the rest of the continent. Researchers named this previously unknown group the Ancient Beringians, the earliest known distinct genetic lineage tied to the peopling of the Americas, and as Willerslev himself noted, their fate remains genuinely mysterious. Their genes are no longer visible in any modern population. An entire branch of the very first Americans appears to have simply vanished, leaving behind only these 2 small children as evidence they ever existed at all. If you're the kind of person who finds it remarkable that an 11,000-year-old infant's DNA could quietly rewrite the opening chapter of an entire hemisphere's history, this is exactly the moment that happens. The main branch of that founding population, meanwhile, continued moving south, and here too, genetics overturned a theory that had been taught in textbooks for decades. For a long time, the dominant explanation for how people spread beyond Alaska involved an inland ice-free corridor, a gap that supposedly opened up between 2 massive retreating ice sheets, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, through what is now Alberta, Canada, letting early hunters follow herds of big game southward into the heart of the continent. There was just one problem. Archaeological evidence from sites like Monteverde in Chile places humans in South America at least 14,500 years ago, thousands of years before that inland corridor would have actually been habitable enough to travel through. Genetic reconstructions now strongly support an alternative route instead, a coastal migration, people moving south along the Pacific shoreline, skirting around the ice sheets entirely rather than waiting for a path to open up through their center. Much of the direct archaeological evidence for this coastal route now sits underwater, submerged when melting glaciers raised global sea levels after the Ice Age ended, which is part of why it took genetic data, rather than excavation alone, to make the case convincingly. There's a third genetic mystery layered into this story that remains, to this day, fundamentally unresolved, and it's one of the strangest findings in the entire field. Starting with research published in Nature in 2015 and expanded by subsequent studies, geneticists identified something researchers now refer to as the population Y signal, found specifically in certain indigenous populations in the Amazon rainforest, including the Surui and Caritiana peoples. These populations carry a measurable genetic affinity to Australasian populations, specifically indigenous Australians, Melanesians, and the Andaman Islanders of the Indian Ocean, a connection that has no clear explanation and shows up nowhere else in the genetic record of the rest of the Americas. A follow-up study led by researchers in Brazil and Spain, examining genetic data from hundreds of indigenous South Americans, confirmed the signal was real and statistically robust, not a fluke of a small sample size, while still being unable to identify exactly which ancient population carried this Australasian-related ancestry into the Amazon, or precisely when or how it arrived. The leading hypothesis involves an unsampled ancient population somewhere in Northeast Asia or Beringia itself, a group with Australasian-related ancestry that contributed to the founding of the Americas alongside the primary founding lineage, then simply vanished from the historical and archaeological record everywhere except in this one small, deeply isolated corner of the Amazon. As of now, no ancient DNA sample has ever been recovered that fully explains where population Y actually came from. It remains a genuine, open scientific mystery, one of a shrinking number of true unknowns left in the story of how humans came to populate 2 entire continents. There's one more chapter in this story worth understanding before we get to the most disturbing part, because it shows exactly how badly this kind of genetic evidence can be misused when politics gets involved, and how directly DNA eventually corrected it. In 1996, a nearly complete male skeleton was discovered along the banks of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington. Radiocarbon, dated to roughly 8,500 years old. Early forensic analysis of the skull's shape led some researchers to argue that Kennewick man looked anatomically distinct from modern Native Americans, with cranial features some scientists controversially compared to circum-Pacific populations like the Ainu of Japan or Polynesians. That conclusion became the center of a bitter, decades-long legal battle. A coalition of Columbia Plateau tribes, who considered the remains a direct ancestor and referred to him as the Ancient One, sought repatriation under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. A group of scientists sued to block that repatriation, arguing the skeleton's supposedly non-native anatomy meant the law didn't apply. And for years, court rulings sided with continued scientific study over return to the tribes. The entire legal foundation for keeping those remains out of tribal hands rested on skull measurements, not genetics, because for 2 decades, no one could successfully extract usable DNA from the degraded bone. That changed in 2015 when a team led by evolutionary geneticist Siki Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen finally sequenced Kennewick man's genome from a small hand bone sample, publishing their results in Nature. The DNA evidence was unambiguous. Kennewick man was more closely related to modern Native Americans, including the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation specifically, than to any other population on Earth. The cranial morphology arguments that had shaped nearly 20 years of legal rulings turned out to be simply wrong, an object lesson, as one geneticist involved in the case put it, that skeletal shape alone is not a reliable indicator of a person's genetic ancestry. Following the DNA results, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers formally reclassified the remains as Native American, and in February of 2017, representatives from the Colville, Yakama, Umatilla, Nez Perce, and Wanapum tribes finally received their ancestor back, 21 years after he was first pulled from a riverbank and used as evidence against the very people claiming him as their own. Now here's where the story turns, from fascinating to genuinely disturbing, and it's worth sitting with the weight of this rather than rushing past it. In 2016, a team led by the University of Adelaide's Australian Centre for Ancient DNA, including researchers Alan Cooper and Lars Ferenschmitz, published the first large-scale ancient DNA study of early American populations in the journal Science Advances. The team sequenced genetic material from 92 pre-Columbian mummies and skeletons, ranging from 500 to 8,600 years old, pulled from sites across the Americas, hoping to reconstruct a detailed genetic history connecting ancient populations directly to the indigenous peoples living in those same regions today. What they found instead was a rupture. According to the study, strikingly, none of the genetic lineages identified in these 92 ancient individuals showed any evidence of surviving descendants among indigenous populations living in the same regions today. Not a minority of lineages, not a partial disruption, consistent with gradual demographic change over centuries. Essentially all of it gone, replaced by different lineages entirely, in a transition that lines up precisely with the timing of European arrival and the catastrophic waves of disease, violence, and displacement that followed. Dr. Ferenschmitz noted that the genetic diversity present in these early populations had already been shaped by small founding groups isolated in Beringia for thousands of years, meaning the diversity lost during colonization was diversity that had taken an almost unimaginably long time to accumulate in the first place, erased within a handful of generations. Historians have described the demographic collapse following European contact as catastrophic for centuries, citing estimates that indigenous populations across the Americas may have declined by 70, 80, even 90% within the first century or so after 1492, driven overwhelmingly by epidemic disease introduced by populations with no prior immunity, compounded by violence, forced labor, and the destruction of food systems and social structures. Epidemiologists sometimes describe this as a virgin soil epidemic, a term for what happens when a disease like smallpox, measles, diphtheria, or influenza reaches a population that has never previously encountered it and therefore carries no inherited or acquired immunity whatsoever. In populations with centuries of prior exposure, diseases like these killed a meaningful but survivable fraction of those infected. In populations encountering them for the first time, mortality rates could run dramatically higher, and outbreaks frequently raced ahead of European colonizers themselves, moving from community to community along existing trade and travel networks faster than any army could march, meaning some populations were being devastated by disease years or even decades before they ever had direct contact with a single European settler. What ancient DNA adds to that historical record is not a new estimate of the death toll. It is direct physical confirmation that the destruction ran deep enough to sever entire maternal genetic lineages at the population level, not just reduce numbers, but functionally erase specific ancestral threads that had persisted continuously since the initial peopling of the continent thousands of years earlier. That distinction matters enormously. A population can shrink dramatically and still pass every one of its ancestral lineages forward through survivors. What this study found looks more like specific lineages being extinguished outright in certain regions, with surviving populations descending from different, often geographically shifted ancestral sources instead. If you're the kind of person who assumed the story of colonization's genetic impact would look like gradual dilution rather than outright rupture, this is exactly the finding that overturns that assumption, and it's precisely the kind of finding that deserves to be stated plainly rather than softened. Now, it's important to be precise about what this specific study can and cannot tell us, because this is exactly the kind of finding that's easy to overstate into something even bleaker than the evidence directly supports. 92 individuals, however carefully sampled across a wide geographic and chronological range, is still a modest data set relative to the staggering diversity of societies and populations that existed across two entire continents before 1492. The study's findings describe a strong, statistically striking pattern in the specific regions and sites sampled, not an exhaustive account of every indigenous community's genetic fate everywhere in the Americas. Later, broader genomic research, including large multi-population studies published since, has continued to find genuine long-term genetic continuity in many regions, alongside clear evidence of severe population bottlenecks tied specifically to the colonial period. A comprehensive genomic analysis of indigenous American populations, published more recently, describes evidence for at least 3 separate major population dispersals into South America alone, along with long-term regional genetic continuity existing side by side with these severe colonial-era bottlenecks. A more complicated picture than either a story of total uniform erasure or a story of untouched continuity would suggest on its own. The full picture is one of profound, uneven devastation, not perfectly uniform erasure everywhere, and researchers continue refining exactly how that devastation played, out region by region, site by site, using an ever-growing body of ancient genomes rather than any single study treated as the final word. It's also essential to say clearly that none of this findings means indigenous peoples living in the Americas today are somehow less connected to the deep history of this continent. Quite the opposite. Every indigenous nation alive today descends from ancestors who survived what these 92 individuals, in many documented cases, did not. Genetic lineage replacement in the historical record reflects which specific ancestral threads happen to persist through catastrophe, not a measure of anyone's authenticity, belonging, or historical continuity as a people. Communities' own oral histories, cultural continuity, and self-identification remain the foundation of who they are, entirely independent of what any particular ancient DNA sample can or cannot confirm about a specific regional lineage from centuries ago. Researchers working in this field, and especially those who learned hard lessons from the Kennewick case, have increasingly emphasized collaborative, consent-based research with descendant communities, precisely because genetic findings this sensitive carry real consequences for how history gets told and who gets to tell it. What makes this finding genuinely disturbing isn't a single shocking statistic sitting in isolation. It's what that statistic confirms about the true scale of a historical event that has, for centuries, been described primarily through population estimates that were themselves often disputed, politically convenient to minimize, or simply impossible to verify using written records alone. Ancient DNA doesn't rely on colonial-era censuses, missionary reports, or secondhand accounts written by the very people carrying out the conquest. It measures something that cannot be spun, exaggerated, or minimized after the fact, a direct biological signature either present in later generations or absent from them. And in case after case, region after region, that signature confirms that the destruction was every bit as severe as the most devastating historical accounts have long claimed, and in some specific, measurable instances, even more complete. There's a broader pattern worth sitting with here, one that connects every part of this story, from the extreme bottleneck in Bering thousands of years before any of this began, to the unexplained population Y signal still unresolved deep in the Amazon, to the near-total lineage collapse documented after European contact, to a legal system that nearly kept an ancestor's remains from his own descendants based on a skull measurement that DNA later proved wrong. The story of the first Americans has always been a story of populations pushed to genuinely fragile extremes, surviving an ice age standstill that could easily have ended differently, carrying ancestry from an unidentified population whose story we still don't fully understand. And then, after tens of thousands of years of continuous survival across two continents, absorbing a demographic shock severe enough to erase entire ancestral lines within a few short generations. Genetics doesn't just tell us these people existed. It tells us, with an unsettling degree of precision, exactly how close entire branches of that story came to disappearing completely, and in some real documented cases, exactly how many actually did. It also shows, through the Kennewick case specifically, how easily flawed science can be used to delay justice for decades, and how the same tool, capable of documenting a catastrophe, is equally capable of correcting the record when it's finally allowed to speak. If deep dives like this, where hard genetic evidence forces us to confront the full scale of a history that's often summarized in a single vague sentence, are exactly the kind of content you come here for, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more of this kind of evidence-driven history still waiting to be examined, honestly. In the end, the first Americans were never a single simple story. They were an improbable population, stranded on a vanished land bridge long enough to become something genetically new, who then spread across two continents in thousands of years, carrying at least one genetic thread scientists still can't fully explain. And when the ships finally arrived, ancient DNA now shows us, in bone and tooth rather, than only in old letters and disputed census figures, just how much of that ancient story was cut short, not fading slowly into the modern population. In case after case, simply gone, leaving behind only the genetic echo of who had been there all along, waiting, in some cases for 8,000 years, for a laboratory finally capable of asking their bones the right question.